I'm Adrian Hill, and this is
Lawrence van der Groosen.
And we're going to present this this manual, this guide actually, which we've developed within Connecting Nature through the course of 3 mentoring programs that we put on, and the focus is on design and development. What does that really mean? When we're talking about design and development, you might think of designing things, but actually what we're going to be talking about is designing processes. So who's here?
So is everybody a bit familiar with Mentimeter? Pick up your phones. Also for the online audience, that's fun to sort of see.
And we're going to try, we'll see if we can hook this up to the Mentimeter to see the results.
I already see that Christoph is in the room. Hi, Christoph.
Let's see. It's fairly straightforward.
Because we're going to be using it for a couple of other things during the presentation, so. We have Nahat, we have Ayesha.
Let's see if this works. Try pressing refresh. It might. There you go. There you go. So you just plug in 5306.
Yep.
1767. There you go.
We're getting there.
Do we have any results? You've got results.
Yeah. We have Darm, we have Shirley from Eco Wellness Dublin, we have Policy Officer Climate Adaptation, Wim, Francis, Julie Callebaut from INBO, Jennifer from USA Urban Planner, Jos Natuur.Genk, Magali Province of Flemish Brabant, Angelica, Susanna, Georgia, then we have Anne-Catherine.
Maybe I can ask some general questions. Who of you consider yourselves designers, that you do design in your daily work? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, 5. Who of you are academics? Some of it, a bit of overlap, yeah. Who of you work in business, consultancy, private sector? Okay, a bit of overlap there as well. Government, local government? Good, okay, it's nice overlap.
We have a good
mix,
say,
of interests and expertise.
So we're going to move on to the next slide.
So the topic of the guide, which you will get, I promise you, within around half an hour, is Genk. And Genk is a project that we're using to explain the process of designing. It's a very interesting case study because of the complexity associated with it. Now, Genk, just to give you, for those of you that haven't heard enough about Genk in the last day or two, we'll try and either refreshen your memory or to give you a small introduction. Genk was actually born out of a rural and rather bucolic setting, which was one of the biggest destinations for landscape painters up until the mid-19th and 20th century, and attracted people from all over Belgium, actually, with these examples of these pretty paintings. In the early 20th century, coal was found, and later industry was developed, which radically changed the landscape in a big way. As you can see outside, we've got the evidence of that radical change to the landscape. And of course, one of the focuses of Genk's work within the Connecting Nature project was a stream called the Steamerbeek, which in the 80s became canalized. So it's now become a space which people have essentially turned their backs on, and even residents live almost next door, either don't care about it or even don't know about it. However, in 2015, there was a plan to, it started early in 2004, but by 2015, there was a desire to deal with the potential of this creek which could become essentially the green axis through Kyank. It bisects the city and could help connect the citizens and residents. For those of you that were, some of you may have seen a presentation yesterday by the architect, but essentially, to summarize, it's a project which created spaces along the creek and tried to bring the creek back to its original form in its meandering form. And the ambition was to create something that was much more amenable, something like this. However, when they were developing the project, there was a small problem, and the problem is that right now, a lot of the water comes from the housing, which has been growing over the last 100 years, collects because of the hardening of surfaces, and because of the fact that stormwater and sewage is combined into the same pipes, the water, when it rains, hits the arterial drainage system and essentially flows into the Steamerbeck, into the creek, which radically reduces the quality of the water. And the idea there was, well, hey, this is an infrastructural project. We can find an infrastructural solution, which is we'll just make bigger pipes, right? But in fact, it was much more complex than that. We've got a series of different landowners, a series of different interests, and at a certain point, realized that was unfeasible. We'll go to the next slide. So basically, what started off in this case, a creek, what seemed like a simple problem, neglected, housing that had turned its back on the creek. Relatively few people, even residents, had known about this green space. It seemed like a great potential. It seemed like it was a technically rational opportunity to develop. But as soon as they started working on the project, found out very quickly that there was a technical problem. So the opportunity was to create a technical solution, which was just make the pipes bigger. However, there was no money. It was going to cost millions to fix up these pipes, and it was impossible to dislodge the cash to create the landscape master plan, which was dependent on fixing up the creek system. So what turned into a technical problem became something, you can jump to the next slide, of a question of what else can we do? What comes next? There were opportunities. For instance, SUDS. For those of you that know anything about SUDS, Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, that could essentially decentralize the problem by, instead of sending all the stormwater into the pipes, treating it on the properties where it landed, and minimizing the water that would enter into the pipes, and therefore making sure that the water that actually reached the arterial pipes wasn't going to overflow into the creek. However, there weren't any experiences with these solutions, with SUDS, at an infrastructural level, at an institutional level, and so that became a much more complex problem. It became a question of, you might say, well, we don't have the cash, we don't have the solution, therefore we're kind of stuck, right? So it created this might be a bit extreme to say that it turned into anarchy, but it was a deadlock, you might put it that way. Can we jump back onto Mentimeter?
So who has some experiences with these kinds of situations? Does it sound familiar?
Keep this link live, because then we'll be using it. We're going to be using it a couple more times.
Saying already 6 people saying yes, 2 people saying no. Counting a bit how many people in the room, looking at the camera, how many people are hidden behind that. 9 people say yes. 11 people say yes.
Maybe just put, for those of you in the room that have already voted, put up your hand if this does sound familiar. Okay, so for roughly half the people here, you can see that what seems like a simple infrastructure solution turns out to be far more complex and messy than what you initially started with. So the question is what to do. So we were in this situation, the deadlock situation, not knowing what to do, stuck in a way, having a beautiful master plan which could essentially be realized, but there's a part of it that was always going to remain, you might say, a stone in your shoe, you know? It was going to be problematic. But there's a point where the city realized, well, actually, this is a much more complex problem than what we initially envisaged. We can't do this absolutely on our own. We really need to look for other partners, and we need to be much more open to what the project could entail, what it could actually mean. So from it being a purely infrastructure project, it became something that's much more complex. We're going to be talking about this a bit later, but just to say, there was, at a certain point, there was an acceptance that it was a complex project, and therefore there were many opportunities that could be developed in the process. And it was not just a project, a master plan, but it was a process of creating a stronger connection with the Steamerbeck, creating, developing the process, the project slowly, and an evolution rather than one big one-off project, and something that could really bring people together at the same time.
So what you notice is that in the picture up here, there's a team, but there's an unknown. There's always an unknown in a project, a person of whom you don't know what they can contribute, what might be missing, a voice that is silent. And what we need actually is to make sure that when you have a team, that you're able to have different mindsets. So this is from the De Bono 6 hats theory exercise, actually. Like, what you do is you anticipate that during different stages of developing a solution, you need to have a different mindset. You're not simply going to go from, well, I'm going to go very critical and all of a sudden I'm going to have a big idea, or I have facts and from facts come ideas. That doesn't always work in design. So you need to be able to really tell people how the different mindsets actually work over different processes, over different phases. And for this, we actually use the double diamond. So the double diamond is something that has been developed by the UK Design Council. Show of hands, who has heard of the double diamond before?
Roshan, you don't count because you were part of this mentoring program. We have 1. Who else? Anyone else? 2? Yeah, okay. So it's relatively unknown, right?
Yeah, the double diamond, it's far from perfect, but it allows us to actually begin tackling a difficult and complex situation. So what you tend to do is you start with a launch. The launch is basically to make sure that you're just starting off well. Then you go really into the research phase where you open up and you try to discover as much about the problem, as much about the complexity of the situation in which you're involved. And when you have a lot of that information, at some point, you're going to have to reduce a lot of that information because otherwise it becomes really difficult to come up with ideas. I always say, for instance, if I need to design something for 7 million people, that becomes quite heavy on my brain. But if I have to design it for 7 people, that becomes actually a lot easier. So that's the first stage of the double diamond. Afterwards, we actually go into an ideation phase. So we allow people to really just freestyle, come up with any possible idea, to then actually refine it and prototype it to see, does it actually work? Do we need to make adaptations or not? And if we're ready, then we could actually start an implementation phase. So that is actually what the double diamond is. Now, yeah, we already asked the question whether it sounds familiar.
Not
We're
quite.
going to go to the next slide. So the double diamond actually, if you combine it with the 6 thinking hats methodology of de Bono, it sort of shows you that you need to have different mindsets throughout the process. So you're not always going to have to take the same mindset in a specific process. During the launch, you're really going to have to look at the facts, you're really going to have to look at the emotions that are present, you're going to have to look at the planning, and you're going to have to be very critical. But this is going to change over the entire process, because not every stage requires the same kind of mindset, which also means that if you're going to form a team, you need to make sure that everybody in the room at least is able to do a bit of these mindsets. So that's actually the really important thing with regards to the double diamond. Another thing that I really should mention is this looks like a linear process, but it's actually not. It's just the starting stage for a project. A project needs to start somewhere. You need to basically get a grasp of what has happened. So once you go through the entire process, you can actually go back to different steps in the process, simply because you might detect that there might be issues, certain unknowns that you really haven't thought of, and that makes it actually a more circular, systemic process.
So you might, for those of you that, I think there were about 5 of us here that said we were designers, this is not necessarily a process which designers and only designers necessarily would be using. It could be used absolutely by everyone. It's more about a design mindset, a design approach to dealing with complex problems. So for those of you that may not have felt like you were comfortable putting up your hand to say you're a designer, you probably actually do a lot of design. You're probably just not conscious of it. So this process can really help you in terms of dealing with complexity. So what we're going to do now is just look at how this process would be related to Genk, which is useful for you because some of these projects have been already presented. There are people from the city of Genk here. I see Jos here, who's very familiar with the Steamerbeck. You can always ask him later. Genk didn't necessarily follow this process, but it's a very useful case study. So we're giving just a small caveat there. So when the Connecting Natures project started, it started at the point where there was a realization that there was a deadlock because of this story with the water situation, the water quality. Even though there was a desire to have something looking like this, that was the dreamy ambition. It was stuck because of the water situation. So the idea there was initially in 2017 to find a way to deal with the water more locally by that means at the source, so that we don't overload the drainage system. So we don't necessarily need to replace the drainage system, which means that funding can be channeled into fixing up the landscape, which is essentially what the focus and the priority of the project was. So that was the ambition. But how to get there? So on the second stage, in this discovery phase, there was a mapping process that was done to look at coalitions, to look at interest groups. This is called the pentahelix. This is a tool which we developed, which we'll be presenting a bit later. But there was a mapping process to see who were the key actors involved that needed to get involved, because there was an acceptance that this was a participatory process, at least on an institutional level, and then later on in terms of the community. We'll talk about that in a second. So this is you'll see all of these diagrams in the book, so you can read in detail what all this means. But there was a mapping of the actors, you might say the field of actors, an engagement of the active stakeholders, and then a creation of a team to get things moving, get things dynamized. But on the other hand, there's also an acceptance that there were end users that could also be involved in the process, and so much more decentralized actions and activities were developed. So for instance, there's a project which has been launched recently called the Steamer Hub, which is very much focused on the end users. So yeah, looking at who were going to be engaged in the process. The third phase for Genk was an acceptance that it wasn't just an infrastructure project. So they did a lot of analysis, exploration, internalization of what had just happened, to look at actually what was the focus of the the Steamer Valley project. And what happened was there was a reframing at this phase, at the define phase. There was a reframing of what the project was, and it came down to 4 different objectives, because there's an acceptance that this wasn't just about nature and public space, but it was also about culture and how culture and nature intersect. So you have connecting, there's a typo here, forgive us, connecting nature, connecting nature with people, connecting people with people, and connecting nature with entrepreneurship. You've probably, for those of you that have followed some of the presentations from the City of Genk, you've probably seen this already. But then, in terms of the focus of the implementation, there were 3 key areas. It was the project, the master plan or projects, the steamer deals, that was softer interventions, and then there's a communication participation element. So that was how the City of Genk reframed the focus. In the ideate, examples of ideation are these steamer deals. So the City of Genk gave a little bit of support, either through communication or through a little bit of financing, or supporting by getting access to space, to support initiatives. And so the idea there was about creating new ideas to see what kind of opportunities arose. So the ideate phase is really about thinking, opening up, all ideas are possible. So with the steamer deals, it was basically, anyone who has an interest, has a little project, the city was willing to support them. In a very small way, the funding was very small, but the opportunities then created pathways to much more serious projects. In the prototype phase, the City of Genk were prototyping in a way a form of governance, because it wasn't just about the City of Genk managing the whole process. It was very much about opening things up, and not just opening things up to anyone, but just very much also focusing on the local community to see how they would provide a proactive role in the process. Firstly, through engagement, but also much more active. And so you have the Friends of the Steamer, and more recently we have the Steamer Hub. In creating the Steamer Hub, that's there's a building which is an example of an implementation process. So for those of you that has anyone been to the Steamer Hub? There's a couple of you. Okay, good. So this is a 3-year project. to create a space for the community to engage with the steamer valley, so that they have a place where things can happen, an intersection point. It's almost like a clubhouse. There you go. So that's examples of what the process would look like in Genk.
So now I'm going to talk a bit about the tools that we can use in design. And specifically, when you go through the book, through the manual, you're going to see that these tools, you can use them actually over different stages. The main goal is you need to know what kind of information you want to get at a certain moment. And some of these tools will really help you get that information. It doesn't mean that they're perfect for every stage, but they are a way to get the stakeholders, the actors, into a certain flow so that developing solutions becomes a lot easier. So, for instance, the first tool that we chose is context mapping. Context mapping is actually quite handy because what you do is you start by defining long-term trends together with the stakeholders. You start looking at what is actually present in the administration, in the system that is going on, and what are some of the niche initiatives. So for instance, if somebody is making honey or doing beekeeping, and that is really something that is important for the nature-based solutions, then you want to go and have a talk with these people. So the context mapping is very important for the designers during the launch phase and the discover phase, because it really shows you who do you need to go talk to and where does everybody kind of want to go to. So it also allows you to get more alignment.
You might have seen this yesterday. There was an example from Jan Rotmans with this little scheme.
Then the next tool is actually the pentahelix and stakeholder mapping and management. This is very important because, especially during the launch phase, you want to know with everybody who's present who they think are important players. And as soon as you go into the discover phase, you want to look at this again, because you might be overlooking key players that you actually need to talk to through interviews, through focus groups, to get more information about what their needs are. And this is actually going to help you a lot in just defining and making sure that you will be talking to everybody, and that you're not going to simply end into a situation where there's a lot of opposition coming against you because you ignored specific people. Then, my favorite exercise is actually the statement exercise. So this is a good way to discuss the elephants in the room. So every project starts with people who have certain expectations. So you read a specific brief, and what happens is everybody, well, you know, when a brief is written or a tender is written, it's done in a very short way, very fast. Once it's granted, you don't really know anymore what was written in there, so everybody starts creating their own ideas about this. So what the statement exercise allows you to do is actually you start looking at the elephants in the room. So what is everybody expecting actually from this project? And the handy thing is that you want to ask people, so you give them a radical statement, and you want to get people as much in the same direction as they can. So it's handy is if people basically disagree as much as they can with each other, and they have to justify why they disagree or agree with something. And this is actually going to do two things. First of all, it's going to tell people, well, look, you're not in opposition necessarily with each other. You're all going into the same direction, potentially for different reasons. But if you, for instance, do a discussion, very often people don't listen to each other. Here, because they know that they're going into the same direction, they will start listening to each other, and you will hear all of the arguments. So that is actually why the statement exercise is very handy to know which issues might arise, but also to already start forming a team. Then we have personas. So we talked about the end users, end users tend to be very difficult sometimes to imagine. So if you're designing for the government, or let's say for the city of Genk, you're designing a solution. Well, there are different profiles of people for whom you're going to have to design who have different needs. So you want to be able to not have to design for the entire city of Genk, for the entire population, but you want to have an image of the key players so that you know that, what kind of needs they have and what you're going to have to pay attention to when you're going to design solutions, when you're going to come up with ideas. This is important because if you don't have a persona, you will always have to go back to the entire population and ask for a lot of things, and that will really block you during the ideation phase. So a persona is really a very powerful tool, and very often you also have a user journey that you link to it, so that you understand at least the people for whom you're designing and where the sensitivities are. So this also allows you to strategize a lot better for solutions. Then we have a user test, and the user test is very interesting in two stages. During the discover stage, so if you have a specific solution that is already going on, you can test it. So you basically take a group of about 6 or 7 people, you create a semi-structured interview, and you start going with them over the existing solution. They will tell you immediately what is wrong with it, what they don't like. They will give you a lot of information on what you need to improve. But when you start going into the prototype phase, this is actually a very useful tool. You can have a low fidelity prototype, which means just a drawing on a paper. You just present it to 6 or 7 people, and they will tell you, well, this can work or this will not work. So they tell you that information very clearly. This is used a lot in the IT sector, and what you generally do is you have different sessions of user tests. So you first start with a low fidelity sort of drawn or simply a story of a solution, of a prototype. You present that to the group of people. They tell you what they like, what they don't like. Then you make an adaptation and you present it again to a different group of people. They will, if the same problems arise, then you know that there's still a big issue with your prototype. If they don't arise anymore, you can be already a bit more sure that your prototype is going into the right direction. It allows you to move a lot faster. One more essential rule about the user test: the person who designs the solution is not allowed to do the user test, because they're too emotionally involved in the design. So they will actually take any kind of critique very personal. So there's always a rule that the designer does not do the user testing. And then we have the project environment canvas, which is what Adrian was talking about with regard to reframing. It's also a very handy tool to just start looking at the wide range of information that you've been getting during the discovery phase and just write it down. What are potential issues that you're still going to be confronted with? It makes it very easy to get an oversight of the different elements you need for the project. Then we also have concept cards. And concept cards are actually very handy because not everybody knows how to come up with an idea or how to describe an idea. So a concept card allows you to actually sketch out your concept, your idea. So you ask people, for instance, during a session, an ideation session, well, please start describing your idea. Some people will do it very visually and they will start drawing it out. Other people will do it more in a verbal way. So you will ask, for instance, what is the name of your concept or your idea? So it becomes already more personal. What problem does it solve? How does your concept work? And is it radical or is it careful? There are also other tools afterwards that you use to assess the feasibility and impact of the solutions in order to make the decisions.
But you might say the benefit of something like this is that it allows people who may not have studied design, who may not even be able to draw properly, to still be able to find a way to structure their thoughts, to be able to communicate. And that's often what happens when you're dealing with multidisciplinary teams, and you need to find a way to communicate, but everyone has different forms of communication because of their backgrounds, because of their training, or sometimes it's because of language as well. So very useful and quick tool for that.
And then we have a very important one. I think that maybe everybody who's been involved in a project knows that decisions are the most difficult things to take. There's always something like choosing is losing. So the fact is that it becomes very difficult to know what people want. And sometimes it can be actually a very stressful process because there might be group dynamics at play. If you're in front of a CEO with a lot of workers, they might not want to show that they're disagreeing with the CEO. So you need to actually pay a lot of attention to how you get to a decision, how to make that as democratic as possible. So there are different ways. You can do a dot voting, and that's simply where you give people a couple of dots and you ask them to put it on the solutions that they like most. But there's also the possibility to rank, and we're going to try that out just in a minute. This is important because you want to know what people like, but also what they don't like. Because what they don't like can actually really be jeopardizing to the implementation of the project. And then we have the nature-based business model canvas, which is a business model canvas which will allow you to prepare after you've been making the prototype to really start the implementation. Is everything ready to start implementing, or do I still need to go back and look for more information in order to do so? So now we're going to do the two types of voting.
Maybe we can go back quickly over all the previous 9 tools, just to have a quick reminder. So the voting now is, so this is an exercise simply to test the one of the or two of the.
They're all listed on the screen.
So long as you remember what they were.
Yep. Connection lost. Reload.
So the first question is Lawrence.
So the first question, if my internet connection is willing to. Yeah. So which of the tools did you like the most? So you have 3 votes. I'm seeing that, now a lot of votes. If it would be possible to show the results on the screen, that would be awesome. Otherwise, I'm just going to turn around my laptop, but connection is lost again for some reason. Give me my iPhone. Yeah, there we go. So what I'm seeing on the screen, wow, like now a lot of dots are coming in. So with the dots, you basically have a way of structurizing like which solutions get the preferences. The handy thing about using something like Mentimeter is that you do it. I do not want to connect to the Tor network, but it seems to really like that. So what it really allows you to do is it gives anonymity. So people are not afraid to vote for something that a very powerful person near them might really be like for. So that's something that is a very powerful tool. And then we're going to, again, my iPhone, reload and go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to ask you to rate which tools you actually liked most. And we know that this is actually an exercise that is a bit more difficult because you have to make a choice. But what is most important is actually the top 1, 2 elements, and then the bottom 2. Because you know that people who really don't like a specific solution, that might be a solution that you want to stay clear of. So I see that, for instance, personas, the pentahelix, concept cards is really getting a move on. It's also handy, like, well, I can't show you what I'm seeing on the screen. So I get in real life, that's even better. Like, you get in real time a very complicated assessment of what a group is thinking. So if you want to do this in an analog way, there we have it. So in this way, you can actually get immediately a very good overview of what people really want and what people really don't want. I'm a bit offended that my statement exercise did not get that much attention, but that's okay. I'm the designer. I'm too emotionally involved in that.
It's okay. You can cry over lunch. I'll give you a hug. Now, questions. Does anyone have any questions, reactions, feedback? There's a roaming mic somewhere back here. I can otherwise pass the mic. You can otherwise. No, we have to use mics because we're live and direct to the world. Anyone find this familiar, useful, maybe helpful for their work? Couple people? Okay, good. It's not self-evident. It's obviously not self-evident. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I like these Bono heads to keep that in mind when you do this kind of processes. The question is, of course, how you do that in reality, because you quite depend on volunteers who come to your processes, or you have to work with your civil servants who have to work on that. Do you have to let people identify themselves, or how do you get to know which kind of bonus you have there? So I just wonder how to use it in practice.
I'm going to give you a very annoying answer. You need a psychologist sometimes to be very handy to assess that, because as a psychologist, I am a psychologist, and we judge people constantly. We say that we don't, but we actually do. So we immediately come into a room and we will say, okay, that person is more the critical thinker, that person is more like that. And you can also ask them to self-report and then sort of see, well, you know, is that in line with reality or not? And it will give you a lot of information on who you have in the team. But having an expert facilitator, they will basically be able to really map out very fast what kind of people are able to do what kind of thing.
It's absolutely not self-evident to be able to take off one hat and stick on another and pretend, okay, now I'm going to just be thinking rationally, and the next thing I'm going to be thinking totally emotionally. It's not so easy. So there's two ways of doing it. One is you use the hat system, which is what de Bono promotes. Otherwise, you identify people who, at a certain stage of the process, take on board. They take responsibility for thinking through the facts, the emotions, the process, things like that. So
and you give them the mandate. That is very important. So somebody is able to criticize. You give them that role. You can criticize, And then everybody knows, like, you know, it's not that this person has something personal against the project or against the solution, but this person is now in the role of being very critical.
Any other reactions, comments, feedback? Yeah.
Just the feedback from experience. I think it's very nice if we all try in our daily work to use some of the methods, because you really activate participants and give them the feeling and also in facts to be a designer. But you also should take care to use the right tool on the right time with the right scope, and be very transparent in it, because for example, the statement exercise, I did it, I thought, very authentically, to see and filter all the opinions, but then someone felt attacked because you filter it, and then you can steer things up, which is sometimes fruitful, but sometimes it's not. So you need some sort of hygiene in using the tool. So that's an advice, but I'm willing to use it.
I completely agree. Coming up with the right statements is actually a very difficult task sometimes, because you can actually rank them in order of importance, or to go to a specific like difficult topic. Very often you begin with a couple of easy statements so people get into it a bit. But you want to do this actually at the beginning of the project, not when things really need to get rolling. So doing it in the beginning of the project identifies some of the really big elephants in the room, and then you kind of see, okay, what do we need to do in order to fix this? So that's where I really like doing it, but I also like provoking people. So,
and people are generally at the beginning of a process much more receptive to giving comments. I know Jennifer, we were talking just a moment ago about the skill of managing processes or dealing with design, or rather, Jennifer asked the question. Do you is this essentially, is this a fixed structure, or do you need to have skill to be able to interpret the process, if I can paraphrase? But it involves both, and so it does help if you are embarking on using a process methodology to test it, to try it out yourself, to get familiar with the process. And don't do it under pressure. So ideally, if you are going to use it, find a project or an opportunity where you can apply it and take risks, but where maybe no one's going to notice, or where it's relatively safe, or it might be your own project where you have your own time. But if you do want to take the risks, then it is useful to have an expert that can support you. You don't, as a designer, you don't need to know everything, but it's a question of who you have around you to support you. So collaboration in dealing with complexity is almost it's necessary, because often it involves problems that are far too complex for yourself to deal with. So yeah, surrounding yourself with people with certain capacities and skills is also very important.
And maybe to just add to that, if you have somebody who is a facilitator or a mediator, they get also the mandate to sort of step more outside of the project and really be the person who connects the dots. So very often they're trained in these exercises. So one of the goals of the guide is to just make you aware that these exercises exist, that you can use them, and if you feel comfortable doing them, you can do them. If you don't feel comfortable doing them, there are people out there who do them. So, yeah.
Is this on?
I think it is.
We can hear you.
Great. Mission accomplished. Now, so having said that design facilitation is an acquired skill, some of what we were sort of talking about, do you have either any kind of anecdotes or best practice advice for sort of overcoming the deer in the headlights situation. So, somebody, as if, one of us were sort of facilitating a session using some of these tools, and, there's an adverse reaction there, like sort of, how does one manage that? What goes into deciding whether to wear your hat backwards today or not? Of course, we did have that discussion at lunch.
Yeah. So, a first answer to that question, it's always handy to be facilitating with two people. And it's always handy if the two people are complementary rather than similar. So I was trained by somebody who's very chaotic, and that learned me how to basically hit the ground running. Well, I really like to have things structured more in a way. That was something that he didn't do. But if there was something of a problem during a workshop, he would be able to immediately resolve it. And he taught me that as well. So that is something that I would say is very important. Choose the right partner with whom to do the workshop. The other thing about going with, dealing with aversive reactions, I generally like destroying myself. So I treat workshops very often as a stand-up comedy show as well, where I'm going to be the one who is assaulted, and anybody who wants to pick up a tool, I just provide them the tools to do so. So I position myself as very vulnerable. I'm allowed to make mistakes, and so are you. We're all allowed to make mistakes, and that's the kind of context that you want to create. So if you feel comfortable enough to make mistakes, that communicates to other people that they can be comfortable enough to make mistakes as well. They're not going to be sabbled down, or there's not going to be an extra hammer to knock in their heads. It's just you who opens up the context, sets the scene, and you take a couple of punches sometimes, but you show them, that's part of the deal. We need to get that out in order to continue. And we're going to give you that opportunity to give a couple of punches. I'm able to deal with that.
It's a big question about whether the tension is coming from the methodology or from the contents. So if it's the content of the discussion, that's what you're expecting in a way. You're expecting that friction and tension will emerge in somehow. But if someone questions your tools, your methodology, that's a different story, and you should be prepared for that. And this methodology is very, very flexible, very dynamic. You just need to be familiar with how it works. The tools as well, there are some basic concepts about how it works. There's a bit of theory and maybe even philosophy that goes with it that we've covered very, very, very lightly in the guide. But it's important that you have a familiarity with each of the tools. It's just like the tools. Essentially, every bad artist blames their tools. You need to have a familiarity with your tool to be able to make it work. And so make sure that you practice it in a safe environment before you put under pressure.
Maybe to answer your final question. This is the reason, some people have a bad hair day, I have a bad hair month. So that was basically the main driver of just wearing the cap.
We have 3 points. Thanks, Catherine.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm just wondering, for the nature-based enterprises, often at prototype or startup stage, adding such costs, like facilitation, for to do this effectively, you're going to need to have experienced people. This adds a cost to maybe a startup enterprise that's trying to maybe promote or implement their nature-based solution. Do you have any experience on these costs and where nature-based enterprises can find payment finance for such costs?
It's amazing how many cities, if the cities and regions have funding and support for startups, and I wouldn't be surprised if those organisations already employ some of the tools and methods that we've outlined in the guide. As that's the problem. Also, if you are a startup, you're probably not necessarily a well-versed designer. You're an entrepreneur. You're going to take risks, and all I can say is that there are lots of tools which are very accessible, very easy to interpret. The business model canvas, probably one of the who does not know about the business model canvas here? Does not know about it. So we all know. I guess there's 1-2 people that don't know about the business model canvas. Everyone knows about the business model canvas. It's a very simple tool, and it's very easy to use. What is very useful is having someone outside of your project to provide you outside advice, and you can do that in many ways. It could be a friend, a family member. It could be paid help, someone who is really trained in doing that, and that doesn't need to be really expensive. It could be pricing can go from between 500 and 1,000 a day, which may seem expensive, but it can be invaluable if you're about to embark in a serious project where you're going to be potentially putting hundreds of thousands on the line.
You also have no idea how many friends I've used for user tests. Like
me included.
They do it for intrinsic motivation and a dinner. So
there was another question somewhere around here. No? Okay, I have a question from the front.
Another question, just a reaction. So if there are kind of awkward or difficult situations, I think underlying it's mostly about relationships. And then maybe they express it, they don't like the methodology or they don't. But if the people come back with, not trusting each other or something like that, I would hypothesize that's mostly the main reason, but maybe you have other experiences.
What I tend to do when I come into the first meeting with like a client is I start asking, what are the sensitive topics? Well, what if we're going to start with the group? What am I supposed to expect so I can prepare myself a bit for that? And then the next thing is when the meeting actually happens is I try to detect the fear, the people, if there's fear or if there's anger in the room, because those are the two emotions that drive people to really go for something.
To close up their creative thinking process.
Yeah, but they are the people from whom I want to hear. I want to listen to their arguments because they have very often very interesting arguments. They just don't know, they just don't get the right platform to express them. But as soon as they express them, they might very often be your leader, like your pullers to really get the project going. So it's really about not fearing them and showing care for them. They really care for it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there and they wouldn't be so angry or fearful.
Any more reactions, comments, questions? Yes.
Something maybe in relation to it. So do you have any recommendation, like when dealing with power dynamics in a group? Because that's something that at least I recognize a lot that can also really bring like a lot of tensions and a lot of like also a change in a process. So yeah, do you have any insights on how to deal with that, or even to map power dynamics before starting the project or as part of the process?
Yes. So the first thing would be to be aware of who is really very powerful or who is really dominating. And if you notice that it has quite an impact on the group, then you can approach this person separately and hear why they really want to express their emotion quite a lot or their opinion quite a lot. But very handy are a lot of the tools where everybody needs to write something down, so that it's not simply this person that gets to talk all the time, but that everybody is able to just write down their ideas. And sometimes what happens, for instance, during the statement exercise, if I see that one person is going against it, but all the rest is going for it, I'm immediately going to ask the person who's for it, like, wow, that's quite interesting. So why are you for it? And I'm also going to allow people to change their opinion. So very often then they start noticing that it's all relative. So it's going to be through collaboration that they need to do it. And sometimes the people who are very dominating in a project, they're really fearful. They can't let go of the control. So just having a talk with them, reassuring them, that is really very often the main thing to do. I sometimes also call my job group therapy for organizations.
And maybe as an introduction, I'm Hannah, I'm also part of Osmos. And so in line of that, I think, we as Osmos, we often come in as an external party. And that really allows for us to be the dumb ones in the room and ask everything to everyone. Like, we have an excuse to kind of dig into histories and whatever, because we simply are not aware of them yet. And that is like, if you feel there are a lot of tensions or maybe strong power dynamics, like just having someone who's external and just can play the idiot and ask all the questions and dig into the underlying fears is something that can help also to get the minds out of the meeting.
Is this my segue to have a plea for collective idiocy?
It might be the plea for lunch.
Yes, I think
unless there's some very last reactions, comments, there is another.
From Hopin online, and there was a question if you could share the copy of your handbook on.
The handbook is going to be shared on the Connecting Nature website. I think it's connectingnature.eu. We have to fix it up. I do apologize. The version that you have does contain one or two typos. Don't hate us for that.
But just touch the screen and imagine really like nice paper.
And the guide will eventually we'll have it on our website as well, which is osmosnetwork.com. But you'll find the link in the on this guide. Yes, it will be available very, very soon.
And thank you for being the coolest audience.
Thanks so much.